Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Nancy Shore and Frank Howard? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I'll put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Nancy Shore and John Franklin Howard lived in the state of Texas. John went by the name Frank. The couple met at a church in San Marcos and became romantically involved. They married in 1983 and had a daughter in 1985. Nancy and Frank eventually moved to the town of Carrollton, Texas, just north of Dallas, and had 2 more children. Nancy was a stay-at-home mom, and Frank worked in his own accounting firm. In May 2009, Frank landed a new client who was a defense contractor. The client eventually hired Frank as the chief financial officer of his company. Frank's new position meant a lot of traveling, which Nancy was not happy about. In July 2009, Frank met a woman named Suzanne at a casino in Lake Tahoe. She was in the process of getting divorced. Frank made it clear that he was unsatisfied in his marriage. The relationship between Frank and Suzanne progressed. Frank acted as though his marriage with Nancy was all but over. He claimed that they were sleeping in separate rooms in their house. In reality, Nancy and Frank were not planning on getting divorced. Frank started providing Suzanne with a substantial amount of financial assistance and paid for her travel so they could meet. He even started a $700,000 IRA for her and put her on the payroll at his employer's company so she could get health insurance coverage after her divorce. Suzanne was eager for Frank to get divorced from Nancy so they could be together permanently, but he kept coming up with excuses. Suzanne was running out of patience. In the summer of 2009, one of Frank's accounting clients employed a woman who was allegedly being harassed by a man named Billy Earl Johnson. Billy was a career criminal who regularly used methamphetamine. He had just been released from prison in February 2009. Billy was the leader of an informal and disorganized band of criminals who lived in an economically challenged area. He was not the type of person with whom Frank would normally interact. However, Frank gave him a call. He offered Billy money to kill his wife Nancy. Billy wasn't interested in murder, but he was interested in money. He decided to string Frank along. Billy wanted to get as much money as he could from him. He included his girlfriend Stacy and others in the scam. Initially, Frank met with Billy and gave him an envelope containing $60,000 in cash and a photograph of his wife Nancy. Frank directed him to make the murder look like an accident. Not surprisingly, Billy quickly burned through the money. He decided that he would murder his brain with methamphetamine instead of murdering Frank's wife. Billy contacted Frank and requested more money. They met again, and Frank gave him an additional $35,000. Billy once again burned through the money in record time. Billy kept telling Frank that he was trying to kill Nancy, but every time he was ready to carry out the plan, something would go wrong. For example, Billy said that he was under the influence of drugs, in jail, or people were getting in his way. Frank was not happy with all the delays, but kept giving Billy more money. Throughout the entire conspiracy, Billy was given about $1 million in cash and $1 million in bail bonds. The latter was necessary because Billy was getting arrested frequently. In addition to methamphetamine, Billy used money to purchase a boat and a camper. He rented hotels for drug-fueled parties. He bought motorcycles for each of his 3 children, go-karts for his grandchildren, and a riding mower for his bodyguard. Considering Billy's financial management skills and the fact that he failed to deliver on a promise, he would have made a pretty good candidate for Congress. By May of 2012, Frank was getting pretty upset about the delays. He was mortified that career criminals were not following through with their commitment to murder his wife. The conspiracy had been going on for almost 3 years and was still homicide-free. Frank still tried to persuade Billy to move forward, but Billy ended up in jail again. This time, Frank did not bail him out. Stacy's son Dustin started communicating with Frank and eventually offered to take over where Billy had failed. Frank gave Dustin $24,000 and told him to beat his wife to death with a baseball bat at a Mothers of Preschoolers convention she would be attending. After Dustin blew through all the money on methamphetamine, Frank gave him some more. In July of 2012, Dustin attracted the attention of the police while driving around Nancy's neighborhood looking for her house. The police pulled him over and placed him under arrest. He eventually told them that he was a hitman who had been hired to kill a man's wife. The police didn't believe him, and he was released from jail. Dustin did not follow through with the murder, but his admission to the police about being a hitman would play a significant role in the case later on. Frank Howard eventually hired Billy's nephew, Michael Speck, to commit the murder. Michael Speck contacted a man named Michael Lawrence to assist him. The two men had once been cellmates. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On August 18, 2012, Nancy drove to a Baptist church in Carrollton, Texas, to attend a baptism. When the baptism was over, Nancy left the church. This was just before 7:30 p.m. She didn't realize that she was being followed by a silver Nissan sedan. The vehicle was occupied by Michael Speck and Michael Lawrence. On her way home, Nancy stopped in the drive-thru at a Taco Bueno fast food restaurant. She made her purchase at 7:32 p.m., then continued home and pulled into her garage. When Nancy exited her vehicle, Michael Lawrence grabbed her from behind. He threatened her with a semi-automatic pistol chambered in .380 ACP and demanded her purse. Nancy broke free from him and turned to face him. Michael once again demanded her purse. In a panic, Nancy handed him the Taco Bueno bag. Realizing her mistake, she then gave him her purse. Michael pointed the pistol at her face and pulled the trigger. The bullet struck Nancy in the head just above her left eye and traveled down her throat into her right lung. Nancy was severely injured but was alive. Michael left the scene with Nancy's purse. Nancy managed to get to her feet, enter her house, and call 911. She was transported to a hospital. Nancy survived but was permanently injured. She lost her left eye as a result of the shooting. The police started their investigation and made a few interesting discoveries. For example, Frank was having an affair. Investigators heard the story about how Dustin admitted to being a hitman. Billy contacted the police from jail, all too eager to tell them about Frank. And the police received a tip implicating Michael Lawrence as the shooter. Investigators were able to put the puzzle pieces together. They believed that Frank had repeatedly tried to hire a hitman and was eventually successful. Michael Lawrence was arrested in connection with the shooting. He was convicted of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and sentenced to 60 years in prison. His conviction was overturned on appeal. He was tried again and found not guilty. The state then charged him with conspiracy to commit murder. He pleaded guilty and received 10 years in prison minus 8.5 years of time served. Frank Howard was eventually charged with attempted capital murder. He went to trial in August of 2014. Frank was convicted and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. He will be about 85 years old when he becomes eligible to be released. Now moving to my analysis. Frank Howard maintains his innocence, and many of his family members supported him. At his bond hearing, several people from the community testified on his behalf and said he was a great guy. Some even offered to post his bail. The state, of course, believes that Frank wanted to get rid of his wife to be with his lover. Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that Frank was guilty of attempted capital murder, starting with the inculpatory factors. Billy and many of his associates testified about how Frank kept paying them money to kill his wife. It's hard to believe that they could keep their stories consistent if they were lying, especially considering their level of intellectual functioning. Initially, Frank allegedly paid the conspirators in cash, but then he started making wire transfers. There was a record of over $300,000 in transfers. When Billy was in jail, Frank talked to him on a recorded line. It was clear from these conversations that Frank had hired Billy to complete a job and was eager to have it done. Frank had been having an affair for about 3 years when his wife Nancy was shot. He was both romantically and financially invested in his lover. For example, they bought 2 properties together. Frank lied to his lover when he said that he was divorcing his wife. After Frank was convicted, he was ordered to repay $6 million he had taken from his employer. Frank's employer accused him of embezzling over $30 million. Moving to the exculpatory factors, many of the witnesses against Frank were criminals. It's possible they were blackmailing Frank because he was having an affair. Frank stopped paying the alleged conspirators weeks before the shooting occurred. Maybe they shot Nancy to send Frank a message. When considering all the evidence, do I think that Frank Howard was guilty? Yes, I believe he was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. Frank Howard was not happy in his marriage and wanted a more exciting relationship. When he met Suzanne, he believed that he found the love of a lifetime. The only problem was that he was married to Nancy. Frank wanted her out of the picture, but he did not want to personally kill her. Frank tried to hire several different hitmen, but he was incredibly naive. The criminals simply took his money without delivering a homicide. Eventually, one of the criminals decided to follow through with the plan, albeit unsuccessfully. Frank had convinced just about everyone who knew him that he was a moral and decent man. In reality, he was cold, callous, self-centered, and had a sense of entitlement. Nancy was among those who believed in Frank. She could not accept that he had hired people to kill her. Nancy divorced Frank before the trial, but stunningly was open to reconciliation and remarriage if he had been acquitted. Nancy was kind of putting everything in the hands of the jury. Like if they found him guilty, she would believe it, but if they found him not guilty, she might remarry him. I imagine that would have been an awkward reunion, mostly because of the attempted murder part. Nancy described the guilty verdict for Frank as a kick in the stomach. She indicated that she still loved him and had forgiven him. Nancy did not speak to Frank after he was convicted, but had questions that she wanted to ask him. For example, what happened to the marriage, and why did he find another woman? Nancy did not think that the shooting was the most devastating part of Frank's behavior. Rather, it was the affair. Nancy tried to understand Frank's behavior by conceptualizing him as 2 different people, Frank and John. Frank was her loving husband. John was the man who wanted her killed. Frank used the name John when communicating with the conspirators. Thinking about Frank as 2 different people gave Nancy a safe place to explore the depths of the betrayal. She could hold on to the reassuring memory of her husband Frank as she contemplated the maliciousness of the attempted killer, John. Ultimately, Nancy came to understand that Frank and John represented just one person, an individual who wanted her to be dead. I think this demonstrates the importance of distance in these types of situations. Nancy needed to be away from Frank in order to see him as he really was, to understand his grandiosity, arrogance, selfishness, and sense of entitlement. Eventually, Nancy remarried and found a full-time job. She moved on with her life. As far as Frank's future, he was eager to employ the services of criminals. Now he will have the pleasure of being surrounded by them, probably for the rest of his life. Now moving to my final thoughts. There are many elements that stand out in this case, including the bravery of the victim, the manipulative nature of the offender, and the haphazard conspiracy. I think the main element of this case, as far as what lessons can be learned, is the nature of infidelity. Affairs are extremely exciting. They hold the promise of a future full of magical love. In reality, infidelity almost always leads to a disappointing result. Affairs bring out the worst in people. In addition to embracing life with a new lover, some desire to escape from their current situation without consequences. Infidelity makes people believe that they can have everything: love, money, property, and freedom. Frank probably looked down his nose at the methamphetamine-using conspirators, but he was on a drug that was just as nefarious and powerful. Those are my thoughts in the case of Nancy Shore and Frank Howard. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.